talk with my hands more, which is the best way for me to talk. So let's go ahead. I am a senior consultant, higher education lead with Baton Global. One of the services that we like to offer specifically to higher education, though we offer it to all industries, is custom research. We absolutely love being presented with kind of big problems and big questions and figuring out the best ways to answer them. So I was really excited. Kathleen, I don't know are you ready to kind of start skipping slides? I can just kind of say, let's go. Okay, so we can go ahead to the next slide. And I'll tell you, when we were approached by VictoryXR, we said, well, what is it that you want to accomplish with this? And through our conversations, we settled on 4 project objectives. Definitely, we want to help answer that question that everybody who is looking at VR in higher education is trying to answer. Is this helpful? Is this successful, right? To do that, we also knew we needed to build understanding of the applications of virtual reality in higher education. And then through all of that, we wanted to not only inform implementation. So how do we use it? How do we help people be successful as they bring VR into their teaching practices? But also, how do we inform expansion? How do we reach more students? How do we reach more educators? And how do we, and I say we because this is a true partnership with VictoryXR, but how do we also inform where we take the technology next, right? And so we put together research design. I always say, questions are plenty, good research designs are a few, right? And so that's the hardest part of doing all of this. So we actually did a pilot at the spring of 2023 that helped us come up with what turned out to be a really great methodology, if I do say so myself, in terms of getting us to be able to work. So as Steve said, this is one of the largest studies done to date, especially when you consider the number of universities and higher education educators who participated in the study. And so the research design was instrumental in making that happen. So we started before the fall semester of 2023 to really get buy-in with some professors and instructors through informational sessions where we showed them what we would be asking them to do through the fall. And what we were going to ask them to do was through August, and we ended up having to go into October to do that recruitment effort. Any of you who have run research projects know that it's really hard. You can build it. It doesn't mean they'll come. So we did a lot of efforts to get people to do our research intake form from professors so that we could learn more about their classes and how they plan to use VR. And then throughout the semester, as they used VR, so we didn't just ask them kind of at the end, how was it? We actually asked them every single time you use virtual reality in the course that you've registered for research, we want you to fill out a really brief, like 3-question questionnaire about how did you plan to use it? Did it work out? What was your perspective on it, right? Was it successful? And then at the end, that's when we brought in student insights and asked for their perspectives. And then after the semester as well, we went back to professors and through questionnaires and some asynchronous interviews, got some additional insights from them, which I'm excited to share with you now. So let's move on to the findings. We'll start with those instructors. So I mentioned the intake form that we used to get information from them. Again, this was a pretty big study. So about 1/4 of VictoryXR's university's partners actually said, yes, I want to be a part of this. Like, we have these same questions. We want to help answer them. And so we had 24 individual professors from 19 distinct universities who ended up being a part of this. And that accounted for the experiences of right over 550 students based on the number of students they had enrolled. Of course, as you can all expect, we didn't hear from all of those students by the end of the semester, but we learned about the experience of over 500 students based off of the insights we were able to get from professors. So most of them were undergrad courses, about 85%, as being graduate. 3 additional universities, they said, hey, we're not going to do the forms, but we will provide you with data because we're running our own similar studies, and let's see how our results corroborate. So just to give you an idea, we did not focus on any specific type of content. This was actually a wide net, and we did that purposefully. So you can kind of see we had people from business, natural sciences, humanities. We covered the whole gamut. Class size distribution, these were pretty much your typical classes. There were that 10 to 20 class size. That's what we saw more than anything, with another third of those being the 20 to 40. In terms of projected frequency, so this is important. We asked this in the intake form. We said, hey, Professor X, right? Oh, that's actually a character. So Professor X, How often do you believe you will use VR over the course of the semester? And you can see that going into this, most said, so I say most, the biggest group, 36% said they were going to use it 2 to 4 times. We had a very small slice say once, but if you add up together, you'll see that over 50% of professors, so 60%, say they were going to be using it up to 10 times, right? And this is how they told us they intended to use it. So there were kind of these virtual field trips, this transporting of students, if you will, whether it was in time or space, right? Hosting lectures, so kind of using it to do something traditional in a non-traditional way. The development and creation, actually getting students to manipulate the VR ecosystem themselves so that they could be creators in it. Role-playing, laboratories, and then learning to use VR to visualize data, which is probably going to be a pretty useful skill moving forward. So we also asked professors how they were going to define success. So this is how frequently you say you're going to use it. This is how you say you plan to use it. How will you know? What is your benchmark for saying it was successful for me and for my students? And as we looked at that thematically, because this was qualitative data, so we looked at that thematically and we came to 4 major themes. Yes, they wanted to see improved learning. Now, those definitions varied, but 46% of professors ended up kind of showing that theme of improved learning outcomes. Positive learner experience was huge in there too. So 42%, these aren't separate percentages, they overlap. 42% said that VR for teaching would be successful if they had a smooth experience, kind of devoid of technical issues. Creating in VR. Again, there were a lot of professors, about 20%, 21%, said that they wanted their students to be able to do more than just consume. They wanted them to create. And then the student perception was pretty big too. They just wanted students to benefit and see it as a useful thing. So let's talk about those learning event surveys. So as I said, every time we called them learning events, every time a professor was going to use VR, we gave them, and this was like my full-time job for a semester, right? You said you were going to be using it around this time. Did you do it? Don't forget your survey if you haven't done it yet. And so we were asking them kind of 3 main questions. Which content or knowledge areas did you intend to support with the use of VR? And that's pulling from literature, kind of on different content areas, where it's operational, procedural, rote memorization. We were asking about that. How are they supporting learning? What type of learning are they planning to support? Asking them to rate agreement with certain statements about the learning event being successful, engaging, students learning what was intended, and a very important question, would they consider using VR again to teach that same material in the future? And then we also gave them an open-ended opportunity to provide additional insights. So here's what we saw from that. Again, we had those kind of Likert items where we said it was successful, they were engaged, they learned the intended content, and they plan to use again. You can see overwhelmingly, we got a lot of agreement, right? So they did feel, hey, this is successful. Learners were engaged. I mean, that's huge. And what we saw the most positive results in was professors saying, I will use this again to teach this same content. They really liked how it went, and that's the goal. It is the teacher, it is the educator who is building this experience, who is really, I will say, kind of the magic sauce in the learning equation. And so when an educator designs an experience and they use a tool that we're providing and they feel that it went well, like that's magic, right? And that's what we saw reflected in the data. Student-wise, and just so you guys know, we have a short amount of time and we want to get to the meaty stuff. So I'm presenting you with the results that I think are going to give us the best conversation here. So we're going to go ahead and move on from teachers and students. So student surveys and those insights, these were at the end of the semester, right? And we wanted to hear about their experience holistically. So we did get student background information. We did ask for their gender, their age. We particularly asked for their VR exposure outside of academia. We had an inkling that was going to be important, and it was. Student experience, we asked them for those same sorts of ratings. We used a scale from the literature for part of this that was about immersiveness of experience and the effectiveness of that. So we used that. And then also we asked them Likert type items in terms of their learning. So was it useful? Was it desirable? That sort of thing. And then also we offered open-ended space. So let's look at that frequency outside of VR. So we were able, because we asked for their age, we were able to kind of block this up in terms of age and that frequency of use. Being myself in one of these bars, I was not surprised by the example. I'm sorry, by the outcome, but you can see that the more frequent usage or usage at all of virtual reality outside of VR, so in their day-to-day lives or weekly or monthly lives, it definitely is greater in that younger demographic, and it changes and becomes less frequent as we get into people more my age, right? And that's exactly what we expected. Now that comes into play a little bit later. So then when we asked everybody all together, students of all ages, all classes, all frequency of VR outside of the classroom, and we asked about their experience, as you can see, extremely positive response. They were interested. They felt it was successful. Of course, they found it impressive. And one of the things that we really liked was here where it says, I felt that I was learning, really high responses there, right? Everybody, I mean, you get that like 72%, as I think is what it ended up being, of people who felt that they were learning from either fairly or extremely. Now, when we go into specific questions about student learning, right? And we asked, did it enrich your experience? Did it support your learning in ways that would have been impossible without VR? Did you receive the adequate orientation? We want to hear all of that, right? Would you like to use VR in the future for similar courses? Were you comfortable with the equipment? Did it have a positive impact on learning outcomes? Right? Do they wish that they had used more VR? Exposure to VR is important, and they'll register. I love this question. Will they register for more virtual reality courses in the future? And so you're able there to see the responses. We did, because, you know, green means go, right? So for those that completely agree or agreed, we put those in green so that it's really easy to read there. But yes, they do feel that VR enriched their experience, their learning experience. That was probably the most positive response we got. Really glad to hear that they felt they received adequate orientation. That makes a huge difference. And that speaks really highly of the educators who are integrating VR. They're doing their due diligence to know how to use it and pass that information on well. I really liked that students feel that their exposure to VR is important, right? We need to hear that from our students. As educators, yes, we want to teach content, but we also want to help our students leave, whether it's for the workforce or continued education or just life in general, having been exposed to the tools they're going to need to use in their everyday lives, right? And we actually heard in the qualitative feedback from a lot of professors that's part of the reason they want to use VR in the first place. They say, I don't know if my students are going to need this down the road, but if they do, my students will be ready. Right? Was really happy to hear that. I also really liked, and you can stay right where you are, Kathleen, but I also really liked that positive response where students say, I want to see more, I want to do more courses in VR moving forward. That speaks really loudly to us. So if you go back and you think about what we asked students in their background part of this survey, do you use VR outside of the classroom? And then you go back and you think about what we asked professors when they came into the study and said, how frequently will you use it in your course? And then you fast forward to all these results we have about effectiveness, about perceptions of utility, and we start to put it together. We cross-analyzed all this data in many different permutations, right? We looked at this in many different ways. And two things really rose to the top, and both of them dealt with frequency. So those two factors that demonstrated possible influence, right? As a researcher, I'm always, saying, hey, we would always need more data, right? Bigger numbers if we wanted to say it for sure. But that's just our training. So the suggested influence in terms of the benefits of VR for their learning satisfaction, the two that came to the top were students reported more benefits to learning with VR when instructors incorporated virtual reality more than 5 times over the term, right? So if you think back to our donut where we had, I think it was 24% of professors that said, I'm going to use this 5 to 10 times. All of those that used it 5+ times, so if you also bring that in, the students that were in their class actually showed higher satisfaction, higher reports of this was great for my learning overall. Right? And additionally, our initial analysis suggests that students who use VR more frequently outside of the classroom perceive it in the classroom as being more beneficial as well. And this is really important for a lot of different reasons. So let's keep going. So let's look at this. We broke it down by frequency just to show those effects. I want to draw your attention because the effects are kind of, this is the whole group, like the whole question of using VR in this course enriched my learning experience. So the first two, the last two are actually the more impactful, and that's what I want us to focus on. These are the ones about the frequency of use in the course, right? So we have the 2 to 4 times because I really wanted to focus on those that were most common, right? So again, 60% of our professors fell in either 2 to 4 or 5 to 10. So we compared those for you here. As you can see, there's a pretty significant difference there between, although both are really positive, right? Yeah, it was enriching. It's much more enriching for those students based on their perspective when the professors used it 5+ times. So we also see that repeated in the question of using VR in this course had a positive impact on learning outcomes. You can see that repeated as well. There again in those last 2 bars to your right-hand side. And then you also see it markedly in the use of VR in this course supported my learning in ways that would not have been possible without VR, right? So there we go. And now I think it's important to recognize that, of course, if a professor is using the technology twice in a semester versus 6 times in a semester, a student's probably going to be exposed to more variety in the applications of the technology, right? So that's probably really playing into this. But what we see is that those markers of utility, of satisfaction, of supportive learning, the more we see professors using it within a semester, the more those markers are elevated. So then at the end of the semester, we went back to instructors and we did some email interviews because scheduling proved to be very difficult around November, December. Imagine that. And a lot of what we got back through our thematic analysis kind of led to this. And these are quotes from there. I'm not going to pause and read those to you right now. Most of you probably have already scanned them all. But I just wanted to kind of point out a few things here. Students were engaged. They felt that their satisfaction was met, and that they, again, here we say from professors, I can't predict whether or not my students will be required to do business in VR, but they're going to be ready for it. So our key takeaways, and I'll be super brief here. Instructors found it highly successful, highly effective, and 100% who participated said they will use VR to teach the same content again in the future. All the instructors believed that it had a positive impact. 86% of the professors' expectations for meeting VR were met, and 40% of the whole group said their expectations were exceeded. Students also responded overwhelmingly positively, as we saw. 89% agreed that VR enriched their learning experience, 78% that it had a positive impact on their learning. 62% wished that the course had used more VR. And of course, actually, that number is different if you break it out by frequency, right? It's a much higher number of, hey, I want more VR for those where the professors used it 2 to 4 times. And then 71% did indicate that they would register for more courses using VR in the future. So I've already, the last bullet point, or those 2 frequency points, the biggest one being, quite honestly, that students benefit more when teachers use it 5 or more times in the classroom. And then the part about frequency, it correlates, the frequency of use outside, right, is highly correlated, as we saw, to age. And so our big takeaway from that is, as we move forward, there's going to be higher expectation of VR, higher acceptance of VR as our students start to age in to higher ed. And so we as educators need to, 1, recognize the effectiveness, recognize factors that improve the effectiveness, and then we need to incorporate more because that's the expectation. So the main takeaways, consistency is key. Prepare for more VR. It's all good news, right? Regardless of age, frequency of use, students are loving it. And then future outlook. Both professors and students see value in integrating VR into the higher education experience. And so that's what we're here to provide. So thank you to our partners. Steve, Kathleen, I want to turn it over to you guys so that we can open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary Beth. And to our listeners, we have about 7 minutes left. I'll ask a question. If you want to ask, just raise your hand and Cassie will bring you through. So my question, Mary Beth, is you did the study, and if you were to put your finger on any students that if there was a particular course or a use case that seemed to really resonate, can you speak to that, or maybe it's just in general?
Yeah, there's so many. I'm typically thinking in themes, right? I'm always grouping data. So we did have some great use cases. I think that what stands out, there's like one educator in particular who was taking a very systematic approach to the incorporation of VR, right? When I look at the students from that class and that course, I see that's where we had some of our highest levels of agreement with like this supported my learning. And it was a systematic approach in that it was how frequently can I use this? And how can I use it to enable experiences that I cannot otherwise do? Right. So it was a combination of that. And that's where we saw the most impact. So how can I allow my students, for example, to manipulate things with VR that I can never allow them to manipulate without it?
Yeah, in my view, I think primarily professors use virtual reality opportunities primarily for a lab, like a weekly lab or a bi-weekly lab or whatever the case might be, twice monthly. And so that's great. But there's also this opportunity to really teach in it every day if you have a remote class. So there are schools and universities who do use it every day. Professor Morris at Morgan College is one of those. I want to jump over to a question that we have from Ilbero. How do we understand your findings in light of research about the negative impact of increased screen time? Namely, is there a possibility that your study may be reinforcing that students are more accustomed to accessing content visually or through screens?
Yeah. So I have a fantastic case study in my own home in the form of an 11-year-old son. Right. And so when I bring that together with this study and then all the other sort of research that I'm involved in, my first kind of response to that would be, this is a valid concern. Right. But what we are learning through the research is that not all screen time is created equally. Right. And there is a big difference in what happens to our brains, specifically when we're engaged in passive screen time or gamified screen time, which I say that cautiously because there's a difference between gamification and addiction enablement, right? And then that active, productive screen time. And that's what this would qualify as. It could be gamified, right? And it could be gamified in a way that is meant to sustain and build attention or memory. Whereas a lot of screen time that's consumer driven, right? That's based to just keep you hooked on these 15-minute cycles of dopamine. That's not really what this is for. And so your question is absolutely on target. And we do have to keep it in mind. There's a lot we have left to learn about even just the physiological effects of some of these technologies. But it's through asking those sort of responsible questions like you are, Ilbero, that we're able to do this in an intentional fashion that provides safe and constructive experiences for learners.
Great. If there are any other questions, we've got a couple minutes left. Go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand. The whole issue of screen time for me, because I suppose I grew up in the 70s and 80s when we watched a lot of television. But when we watched television, that was sort of what America did, and in the evenings you gathered around the television as a family and watched Happy Days or Laverne and Shirley or whatever else the case might be. But that was all one way. And today, what we're trying to achieve, I think mostly successfully, is that your screen time is also engaging your brain and, lighting up. So we've got a great slide that we show sometimes of the brain when it's sitting in class. The brain, it is doing online like 2D, and then the brain in VR. And in VR, it's just lit up, electron, just exploding everywhere. And so, I'm hoping that what we are doing is not contributing to just sort of passive screen like we frequently participate in, but hopefully creating new connections in the brain and students and people learning more. We'll see.
That, and that's a fantastic point. I'm a millennial, right? Like an original millennial. So I had a brick phone. I was around when the iPhone came out. I remember it. I always used paper for most of my schoolwork, right? And it's actually hard for me, even now as a professional. I have to write things to really have it become a part of my brain. Right. And so your part, your question in here, it says, well, are students more accustomed to accessing content visually or through screens? Yes, they are. If my child wants to know how to do something, he doesn't Google it to read it. He Googles it to watch a YouTube video. Right. So if we can combine that visual part of it and the audio part of it, but with something tactile or kinesthetic, I think what we're doing is actually really improving the chances that things will be committed to memory and become a part of someone's informational system.
Great. Well, Mary Beth, thank you for your great work on this study. And Kathleen, your great work on this study. We appreciate it. If anybody would like a copy of the study, we will provide it at no charge. There's a place on our website you can fill out the form, and if you reach out to Cassie at VictoryXR.com, she will provide you access to that page where you can just sign up, and we'll send it over to you. But for everybody that did great work on this, thank you, and I think it contributes greatly to the efforts of all of us in finding better ways to educate, to teach, to learn, the whole package. With that, thank you, everybody. We'll have another webinar coming up, not next week, but the following week. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.